Killer chemicals ooze from a toxic waste dump into a residential neighborhood. World Trade Center Building Number 7 is reduced to a pile of rubble on September 11th, but it wasn't attacked. Patriot missile software problems leave U.S. soldiers defenseless. A nightclub turns into an inferno that kills over 400 people. And the science of building implosion is put to the test and fails. Now, engineering disasters on Modern Marvels. World Trade Center Building Number 7. On September 11, 2001, it was one of the casualties of the terrorist attacks on that horrific day. Building 7's sudden and shocking collapse has been overshadowed by the fate of the Twin Towers. But from an engineering standpoint, it is the greater mystery.
We were surprised that Tower 7 collapsed. We being the team that investigated what occurred on that day. There was some damage to Tower 7 caused by the debris that hit it from Tower 1, but the damage was certainly not similar in scope or magnitude to that caused by the aircraft hitting Towers 1 and 2.
The only positive aspect of this building's demise is that it fell 7 hours after the two main towers. Everyone had been evacuated, and even though the 47-story building collapsed in on itself in under 10 seconds, no one was killed.
World Trade Center 7 was completed in 1987. It had approximately 1.8 million square feet, 47 stories, and was roughly 600 feet tall. Each of the floors was approximately 40,000 square feet, which is roughly the size of a football field and equal to the size of the floor plate on each of the towers.
The building was a good building. It was soundly designed. It would still be standing if not for 9/11. And it was state-of-the-art at the time, absolutely.
One of the challenges the engineers faced in designing World Trade Center 7 was finding a way to erect the building over an electric company substation that already existed on the north side of the site.
As a result, we had to do very many, I'll use the word tricks, transferring of column loads, carrying loads either on cantilevers or on truss systems. It was a challenging project at the time.
Analysis of the collapse of Number 7, which had been burning out of control since the collapse of Tower 1 7 hours earlier, seems to indicate the initial failure occurred somewhere between the 5th and 7th floors. This is where the transfer trusses were built to carry the load over the Con Edison substation. The way the building fell supports the idea that at least one of the trusses was weakened by the fires in the building and gave way.
Once one of those trusses went down, then because of the way everything was interconnected in the floor system, it pulled down the rest of the building.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
The wreckage from Tower 7 was mixed in with the debris from the other destroyed or damaged buildings and removed from the site so rescue and recovery efforts could continue.
We then have to ask, why did the building fail on 9/11? Well, there are a couple of things we could look at. One is, perhaps the column didn't have the right amount of fireproofing. Well, we have no indication that this was a substandard building at all. It is certainly possible that the debris that started the fire in Tower 7, this is the debris from Tower 1 when it collapsed into Tower 7, that debris knocked off some of the fireproofing. It doesn't take much fireproofing to be removed for the steel to fail.
One theory suggests the steel around the 5th floor was superheated by diesel fuel discharged from broken pipes, supplying the building's emergency generators. But the explanation may be simpler. The building caught fire at 10:30 a.m. when Tower 1 collapsed. The water pipes supplying the sprinkler systems were also damaged. And the fire department made the decision to allow an evacuated building to burn for the next 7 hours in favor of trying to save the lives of those trapped in the rubble of the Twin Towers.
If you allow it to burn long enough, it's going to get past the fireproofing material, and it's going to cook the steel, and the steel is going to yield.
To ensure against future high-rise disasters, many different agencies are involved in the ongoing effort to determine the exact cause of the failure. However, this has not stopped the construction of a new building.
We have to rebuild on that site. We have to rebuild on the World Trade Center site. If we didn't, then we lose. And we ain't gonna lose.
Just a little more than a year after 9/11, construction began on a new World Trade Center number 7. Since engineers knew it was to be the first building to rise from the ashes, they made safety features a top priority in its design.
It's going to be 52 stories when it's completed, 750 feet tall in all. Up above us you see, and all around this floor, you see fireproofing. What we've done that's different, that's beyond the code, and indeed beyond normal practice in buildings, is we've made the fireproofing 5 times as durable as required by code. And fireproofing can withstand all kinds of circumstances, and that's a very important safety development.
The stairs are 20% wider than required, which will allow people to evacuate quicker, and emergency teams to move more freely within the building. Beyond standard emergency lighting, the stairways will have track lights on the floor similar to airliners, and if that fails, all the railings and stairs are being marked with photoluminescent paint that glows in the dark.
Probably the single most important safety innovation in this building is that all of the life safety systems of this building are encased in a massive 2-foot thick, in most places, concrete wall. That assures that in the event of an emergency, the life safety systems can support a quick and successful evacuation. The stairs, the water standpipes that support sprinklering, emergency lighting, emergency communication are all protected. The concrete that's being used in the core and elsewhere in the building is what you call high-strength concrete, similar to what's used in military bunkers.
The new World Trade Center 7 building, like the original, is being built over the Con Ed substation. But the structural load is being handled in a different way.
The structure of the exterior of the building relates to the Con Ed substation with a belt wall that takes place just above the level of the substation, where we transfer the loads from the office building so that they're distributed throughout the exterior of the Con Ed substation at the base.
There was pride and determination in the builders of the new World Trade Center 7. Scheduled for completion in early 2006, it represents the finest in current building design and is symbolic of the resilience of a nation. Tenants of World Trade Center 7 included the IRS, the U.S. Secret Service, and New York City's Office of Emergency Management. Engineering disasters will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to engineering disasters on Modern Marvels. Just east of Niagara Falls in northwest New York State, an area with the deceptively serene name of Love Canal turned out to be one of America's most notorious toxic waste horror stories. An inadequate cover on a chemical company's dump site allowed a deadly brew of toxins to leak into a suburban neighborhood. A public health scare erupted.
How can you make decisions? Are you going to live there with your wife? Are you going to put your kids there?
Over 900 families left their homes. Several years and hundreds of millions of dollars had to be spent to try to stop the further spread of the contaminants. The Love Canal originally got its name from entrepreneur William T. Love. In 1894, he began construction on a man-made canal that he envisioned would link the Niagara River to Lake Ontario.
His plan was to use the power of the river as it rushes towards the falls, diverting it before it goes over the falls, and carrying it north through a canal, which would wind up at this escarpment or cliff and pour down and provide the power that's necessary to generate electricity.
The canal was essentially a trench dug in the clay soil of the area. After only 3,000 feet were excavated, a pair of unforeseen events brought construction to a halt.
One was the depression of the 1890s, severe depression. Secondly was somebody named Tesla devised a way to have alternating current instead of direct current, so you didn't have to be right on top of the source of power.
Alternating current made it unnecessary to develop industry and Love's planned city adjacent to his canal. For the next several years, Love's unfinished canal served as a summer swimming hole for nearby residents. Then in 1942, Hooker Chemical Company acquired the canal.
They ended up using the property as a pretty much a 16-acre hole in the ground at that point, 3,000 feet long by 80 feet wide to 100 feet wide, probably anywhere from 8 to 15 or 20 feet in depth. And they used it for disposal of industrial waste from a period of time from about 1942 to 1952 or 53.
By 1953, the canal was filled with over 20,000 tons of chemical wastes, including caustic solvents and pesticides. Hooker had no further use for the canal, and with no regulations in place to stop them at the time, they simply covered the dump site with a layer of clay and soil from the area. Soon grass grew and helped hide what festered just a few feet below.
Of course, everybody played on that area because it's not a canal, it's covered over. And sometimes kids would their feet would get irritated from running around in the canal.
As Niagara Falls' growing population spread, the New York Board of Education was looking for inexpensive land and expressed interest in the property Hooker owned. The chemical company offered to sell the no longer useful land for $1. The deed did contain a warning about the contents of the canal, but that did not stop the sale.
Well, they didn't build the school directly on top of the canal. They built a playground there. And on the black top of the playground, there was like a percolation of a taffy-like watery substance coming out of the ground into this playground.
At around the same time, there continued to be increased development in the area. A series of homes went up around the canal. None of the homes were built right on the canal. They were adjacent to it.
And then a lot of residents complained of not only smells in their basement, but of oozing of the similar types of chemicals into those sub pumps, into the drainage ditches around their basements.
The leachate that was found throughout the Love Canal community was generally a black goop, to use a technical, non-technical term. It was a very thick black material. It was very oily based. It almost looked like a tar-like material. It was more watery in some instances than in others.
Those who had bought homes in the area hadn't been warned in their deeds of what was beneath the grassy field. For new residents like Lois Gibbs, something was clearly wrong. In 1977, her son began attending the 99th Street School.
I just remember after living at Love Canal for a while, Michael got sick. And he kept getting new diseases. He had asthma, liver problems, immune system problem, urinary tract disorder, which required 2 operations to correct. I mean, it was just like one thing after the other. And I could not figure out what was wrong with him.
Around this time, a newspaper reporter wrote a story about the canal and what was buried in it. Now the residents had an explanation for the mysterious substances and illnesses. And Lois Gibbs decided something had to be done.
First, she tried to have her child transferred out of the school, and they told her that they wouldn't do it because there was no problem. There was no chemical problem there. And so she started going up and down the street, talking to people, talking to neighbors, asking if they were interested in joining a little group that would try to get the school cleaned up.
Awareness of the problem and complaints from the residents became much more widespread after the winter of 1977.
It was the precipitation event, the blizzard of '77, that actually overfilled the canal, the bathtub effect, with all of the winter snow, etc., and the actual wet season that we had in 1977 after this blizzard. We had an early spring, an early thaw, and all the water was forced underneath the canal from this clay pit, basically, to the top, and it started oozing out of the top of the canal.
In the late 1970s, there were no conclusive answers about the health risks and long-term effects of exposure to toxic wastes. Nobody was really sure what wastes were in the canal, but deadly dioxin was identified. The Environmental Protection Agency had been formed just a few years earlier and had not dealt with a public crisis like this before. The residents' fear turned to frustration and anger. The Love Canal became the focus of the growing environmental movement and was soon national news. On August 7, 1978, then-President Jimmy Carter declared Love Canal a disaster area, and those living nearest to the dump site were relocated.
Right after the first relocation in August of 1978, they erected a 10-foot fence, a green fence, so it would be environmentally pleasant around Love Canal. And then they put signs on the fence that said, hazardous area, dangerous, do not enter.
Infrared pictures were taken from the air to track the spread of the contaminants. Gray or black in the photos revealed the presence of the chemical waste. After another 2 years of activism by Lois Gibbs and other residents, a second presidential declaration cleared the way for another 500 families to be relocated. Except for a few families who refused to move, Love Canal became a ghost town. Continuing studies revealed the contents of the canal.
There were over 400 chemicals found in the leachate from the Love Canal landfill, from lead and arsenic to lindane, variety of other pesticides, to solvents such as benzene, toluene, xylene, host of others. Many of these chemicals cause cancer. Some of them, or many of them, cause liver problems, liver disease. Many of them cause central nervous system problems. Some cause birth defects.
Over the next few years, extensive efforts were made to clean up the neighborhood.
We cleaned 65,000 linear feet of storm sewers around that entire area. And of course, the hazardous waste byproducts did find their way underground to a nearby set of creeks, the Black and Burkholz creeks that flow just north of Love Canal. We ended up testing the creek sediment and discovering that the same hazardous waste byproducts that were buried now have worked their way via water under the ground to the creek areas. One of the remedies were to actually dredge the creek.
Crews dealing with the toxic dump itself decided that trying to remove, transport, and store the chemicals somewhere else was inviting further disaster. The chemicals were going to have to stay where they were, and a better cover and containment system put in place. The 99th Street School and 239 homes were demolished and placed on top of the canal, and then covered with clay.
And over the top of it, we placed this synthetic liner, and this synthetic liner went directly over the entire 40-acre area, okay? And then after we placed the synthetic liner, we then installed this plastic liner. This liner goes over the entire 40-acre area. So when it rains, all of the precipitation will go through the ground and will actually hit the top of this liner, much like an umbrella. It will run off of it.
The runoff is then collected in an underground barrier drain system. It's then pumped up to the facility at the top of the Love Canal, where it's treated by carbon filters.
It is then discharged via storm sewer to the City of Niagara Falls' wastewater treatment plant, where it undergoes more filtration before clean water is discharged into the upper Niagara River.
The capping and drainage system handles the material so well that anything that gets through is minimal. And we have a series of over 200 monitoring wells in the entire neighborhood to make sure that the groundwater is not being impacted by any of the contamination.
It's been more than a quarter of a century since the Love Canal first became a notorious environmental disaster. New residents have been moving into the area, but many of those who lived there previously will never consider it safe.
This is the Earth. The Earth shifts. And we saw what happened in the blizzard of '77 when we had the snow melt and the river rose, and that, they believe, created a lot of the Love Canal problem. It's foolish to think that they can contain it.
The crisis at Love Canal created greater awareness of America's growing problem with industrial wastes It was also primarily responsible for the creation of a federal program called Superfund. Since its inception in 1980, Superfund has spent more than $16 billion cleaning up over 2,000 hazardous waste sites around the United States, including the infamous Love Canal. Since 1978, more than $250 million has been spent on cleanup and containment of the contents of the Love Canal. Engineering disasters will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to engineering disasters on Modern Marvels. Boston, Massachusetts. In the heart of this great American city lies a memorial embedded in the sidewalk. To a visitor, it may be of little interest, but to the longtime residents, it is a reminder of the deadly inferno at the Coconut Grove nightclub.
Well, for disasters in the United States, the Coconut Grove, up until the World Trade Center tragedy, the Coconut Grove ranked second after the Iroquois Theater fire in Chicago in 1904 in terms of loss of life. Back in 1904 there, they had over 600 people were killed there. The Coconut Grove was 492 people, certainly the largest tragedy in the city of Boston.
The night of November 28, 1942 was a cold night. It was during the war, so there was a lot of gloominess in the air. It was a chill in the air. And people were out to have a good time. And that night, there were, as best as we can figure, about 1,000 people packed into that club. It was licensed for about 500 people.
The nightclub was a multi-room facility that was originally built in a converted garage.
It was a brick building with wooden timbers in the floors and in the ceilings, but the building itself was a good building to be used for a storage facility. They should have had sprinklers back then, but the laws didn't require it.
The club's decor was inspired by the swank Coconut Grove nightclub in Los Angeles.
The Coconut Grove was designed to be a tropical paradise in the middle of chilly Boston. It had fake palm trees. It had a distinct patterns in its chairs and on the walls. It had this kind of zebra pattern on a lot of the furniture. There were bongo drums. There was rattan furniture.
From the standpoint of fire safety, the club's contents were a tinderbox of highly combustible materials. The fire began at about 10:15 p.m. in the Melody Lounge, located in the building's basement, and spread quickly. Its cause has most often been attributed to a busboy who lit a match too close to one of the synthetic palm trees. Jimmy Duggan, enjoying an evening with his newlywed wife and 4 friends, was sitting in the main dining room upstairs and sensed something was wrong.
The few people who started coming up the stairs looked like they were going too fast for me. It looked like somebody's down there with a gun or a butcher knife. But you must remember, all this was going like that. Milliseconds later than that is when it started big time.
The people rushing up from the downstairs lounge encountered the first of many exits from which there was no escape.
There was a door at the top of the stairs from the Melody Lounge to the outside. And this door was even equipped with a panic bar, the kind of crash bar you're supposed to push on it, it's supposed to push through. It was locked.
Panic spread as quickly as the flames, and a flood of patrons raced for the revolving door at the front entrance.
Some revolving doors are much larger than others. This happened to be a pretty small one. This revolving door, as I recall it, only lit at one person at a time. That's when I got all of us, all 6 of us, down on the floor and tell them to put their noses right on the floor, because I could see them were not going to get out.
First few people got through the doors that night, but immediately the doors jammed. A man was trapped in the doors. People came behind and piled up. Reportedly, the bodies piled up to about 8 feet there that night. People climbing over others, trying to escape through that the only way they knew out.
As the fire continued to spread, people throughout the club were trying to escape. Some exits were hidden by curtains. Others were locked to keep people from sneaking out without paying their bills. One door had been installed in a way that guaranteed casualties in a panic situation.
It's tragic to see an inward opening door like existed in the Coconut Grove Broadway Street Lounge, which becomes blocked soon after the first few people who start pushing against that door. It's going to close shut, it stays shut. There's no way around it.
Witnesses there that night report the fire coming in. They report a bluish flame, a yellow flame. It rolled right in, not in like a forest fire effect, eating on the satin draperies in the ceiling, dropping down into the palm trees, the bamboo.
And I determined then at the very end that we're not going to get out of here. And I took my jacket off and put it on my wife. I spread that over her back. It didn't take long. I was the last one of the group of the 6 that lost consciousness.
It took only a few minutes for the fire to deplete the oxygen supply in the nightclub.
Proof of that rapid consumption of the oxygen is the fact that the combustion of the materials, the actual burning of the materials present that night, was limited. There was not a total burnout of that Coconut Grove fire.
Another fire earlier that evening had brought the Boston Fire Department into the neighborhood, enabling it to respond quickly.
Fire was extinguished within a half hour. The department continued to rescue the victims, remove the victims. The police department was on scene. A lot of bystanders had come in now, a lot of soldiers, sailors. They were coming in, helping out. It was just overwhelming, the number of victims. Taxi cabs, police cars, any truck or vehicle available was pressed into service to transport these victims to the hospitals.
A lot of people died from what seemed to be a mysterious gas. There were some people who had like white foam on their lips, and they were the doctors were baffled by it. It looked like they had been gassed to death.
It became evident that some of the gases emitted by the burning contents of the club must have been toxic.
One of the materials that came into question soon after the fire was the leatherette, which was this false leather resembling type material that was used in those days. We don't have samples that we can analyze by our methods today and inspect it and test it in fire tests to see how well it performs. So this is part of the mystery of the Coconut Grove.
Because the fire moved through the club so fast, it is thought one of the gases could have been acting as an accelerant.
Fire seemed to have a momentum of its own. I can only equate it to a ramjet engine, where it just followed the oxygen, followed the fuel, and just went through that place with lightning speed. People were found in the new lounge, sitting at the bar with their drinks in front of them. When the firemen got in there, they told them, "Come on, get out of the room." And these people were dead, sitting at the tables, sitting at the bar.
Many people who were there to help were forever haunted by what they saw. I mean, bodies are being pulled out of the club. There are so many bodies, they were being stacked like cordwood. I mean, this is the phrase you see over and over again with survivors. They stack the bodies like cordwood.
Jimmy Duggan's wife was among the dead. Jimmy woke up in the hospital and began a long recovery from extensive burns. In the trial that followed the disaster, the owner of the Coconut Grove nightclub, Barney Wolanski, was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter.
The people who died and the people who suffered in the Coconut Grove fire did not do so in vain. We've been able to look back and see the improvements in fire testing of materials, medical advances, better understanding of disaster preparedness and disaster response.
The devastating fire on November 28, 1942, was responsible for improvements and stricter enforcement of building codes across America. In Boston, particular attention was paid to the safety code stipulating that all revolving doors should be flanked by hinged doors that swing open outward. There is another law in Boston that reveals the lasting psychological effect of this disaster. It is illegal to name a new nightclub the Coconut Grove. Burn victims from the Coconut Grove fire were among the first patients to be treated with a new antibiotic, penicillin. Engineering disasters will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to engineering disasters on Modern Marvels. computers. We've all come to accept the often frustrating problems that go with them. Bugs, viruses, and software glitches are small prices to pay for the convenience. But in high-tech and high-speed military and space program applications, the smallest problem can be magnified into disaster. On June 4th, 1996, scientists prepared to launch an unmanned Ariane 5 rocket. It was carrying scientific satellites designed to establish precisely how the Earth's magnetic field interacts with solar winds. The rocket was built for the European Space Agency and lifted off from its facility on the coast of French Guiana.
At about 37 seconds into the flight, they first noticed something was going wrong, that the nozzles were swiveling in a way they really shouldn't. Around 40 seconds into the flight, clearly the vehicle was in trouble, and that's when they made the decision to destroy it. The range safety officer, with tremendous guts, pressed the button, blew up the rocket before it could become a hazard to public safety.
This was the maiden voyage of the Ariane 5, and its destruction took place because of a flaw embedded in the rocket's software.
The problem on the Ariane was that there was a number that required 64 bits to express, and they wanted to convert it to a 16-bit number. They assumed that the number was never going to be very big, that most of those digits in the 64-bit number were zeros. They were wrong.
The inability of one software program to accept the kind of number generated by another was at the root of the failure. Software development had become a very costly part of new technology. The Ariane 4 rocket had been very successful, so much of the software created for it was also used in the Ariane 5.
The basic problem was that the Ariane 5 was faster, accelerated faster, and the software hadn't accounted for that.
The destruction of the rocket was a huge financial disaster, all due to a minute software error. But this wasn't the first time data conversion problems had plagued modern rocket technology.
In 1991, with the start of the first Gulf War, the Patriot missile experienced a similar kind of number conversion problem. And as a result, 28 people, 28 American soldiers were killed and about 100 others wounded when the Patriot, which was supposed to protect against incoming Scuds, failed to fire a missile.
When Iraq invaded Kuwait and America launched Desert Storm in early 1991, Patriot missile batteries were deployed to protect Saudi Arabia and Israel from Iraqi Scud missile attacks. The Patriot is a U.S. medium-range surface-to-air system, manufactured by the Raytheon Company.
The size of the Patriot interceptor itself it's about roughly 20 feet long, and it weighs about 2,000 pounds. And it carries a warhead of about, I think it's roughly 150 pounds. And the warhead itself is a high explosive, which has fragments around it. The casing of the warhead is designed to act like buckshot.
The missiles are carried 4 per container and are transported by a semi-trailer.
The Patriot anti-missile system goes back at least 20 years now. It was originally designed as an air defense missile to shoot down enemy airplanes. In the first Gulf War, when that war came along, the Army wanted to use it to shoot down Scuds, not airplanes. The Iraqi Air Force was not so much of a problem, but the Army was worried about Scuds. And so they tried to upgrade the Patriot.
Intercepting an enemy missile traveling at Mach 5 was going to be challenging enough. But when the Patriot was rushed into service, the Army was not aware of an Iraqi modification that made their Scuds nearly impossible to hit.
What happened is the Scuds that were coming in were unstable. They were wobbling. The reason for this was the Iraqis, in order to get 600 kilometers out of a 300-kilometer range missile, took weight out of the front warhead. They made the warhead lighter. So now the Patriot's trying to come at the Scud, and most of the time, the overwhelming majority of the time, it would just fly by the Scud.
Once the Patriot system operators realized the Patriot missed its target, they detonated the Patriot's warhead to avoid possible casualties if it was allowed to fall to the ground.
That was what most people saw as big fireballs in the sky and misunderstood as intercepts of Scud warheads.
Although in the night skies, Patriots appeared to be successfully destroying Scuds, at Daharan, there could be no mistake about its performance. There, the Patriots' radar system lost track of an incoming Scud and never launched due to a software flaw. It was the Israelis who first discovered that the longer the system was on, the greater the time discrepancy became, due to a clock embedded in the system's computer.
About 2 weeks before the tragedy in Bahrain, the Israelis reported to the Defense Department that the system was losing time. After about 8 hours of running, they noticed that the system was becoming noticeably less accurate. The Defense Department responded by telling all of the Patriot batteries to not leave the systems on for a long time. They never said what a long time was. 8 hours, 10 hours, 1,000 hours. Nobody knew.
The Patriot battery stationed at the barracks at Daharan and its flawed internal clock had been on over 100 hours on the night of February 25th.
It tracked time to an accuracy of about 1/10 of a second. Now, 1/10 of a second is an interesting number because it can't be expressed in binary exactly, which means it can't be expressed exactly in any modern digital computer. It's hard to believe, but use this as an example. Let's take the number 1/3. 1/3 cannot be expressed in decimal exactly. 1/3 is 0.333 going on for infinity. There's no way to do that with absolute accuracy in decimal. That's exactly the same kind of problem that happened in the Patriot. The longer the system ran, the worse the time error became.
After 100 hours of operation, the error in time was only about 1/3 of a second. But in terms of targeting a missile traveling at Mach 5, it resulted in a tracking error of over 600 meters. It would be a fatal error for the soldiers at Daharan.
What happened is a Scud launch was detected by early warning satellites, and they knew that the Scud was coming in their general direction. They didn't know where it was coming.
It was now up to the radar component of the Patriot system, defending Daharan, to locate and keep track of the incoming enemy missile.
The radar was very smart. It would actually track the position of the Scud and then predict where it probably would be the next time the radar sent a pulse out. That was called the range gate.
Then once the Patriot decides enough time has passed to go back and check the next location for this detected object, it goes back. So when it went back to the wrong place, it then sees no object, and it decides that there was no object, it was a false detection, and drops the track.
The incoming Scud disappeared from the radar screen, and seconds later, it slammed into the barracks. The Scud killed 28 and was the last one fired during the First Gulf War. Tragically, the updated software arrived at Daharan the following day. The software flaw had been fixed, closing one chapter in the troubled history of the Patriot missile. Patriot is actually an acronym for Phased Array Tracking Intercept of Target. Engineering disasters will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to engineering disasters on Modern Marvels. Architects and building engineers are endlessly refining the technology of construction. But man's penchant for erecting large structures has resulted in the development of another engineering skill: building demolition by implosion. For nearly a century, with some strategically placed charges and the push of a plunger, building after building has collapsed on cue.
An implosion of a building is a more efficient function, a proper way of doing it. When you do the hammer and ball, it takes a great deal of time and it can be very sloppy. A controlled implosion usually uses the laws of physics. So it's a controlled explosion, and the building comes down in one big heap, and you can usually just truck out the material.
The term implosion is often used, but scientifically speaking, it's not an implosion, but rather a set of carefully planned explosions that cause the building to fall in on itself. Generally, to bring down a building, blasters will explode the major support columns on the lower floors first, and a few of the upper stories in taller buildings. Different explosives are used for different materials. When done properly, it's the safest and fastest way to level a multi-story structure. But in May of 1989, one building refused to be brought to its knees. In Providence, Rhode Island, a 10-story public housing structure stood its ground, not only once, but for a second time. It was a most curious sort of engineering disaster. A local company, Bill Ray Demolition, was in charge and brought in New York implosion specialists to bring down the building as part of a multi-million-dollar modernization of the area. The buildings in the housing project to be destroyed were built in the 50s, and to the original architect's credit, turned out to be sturdier than expected.
The buildings were constructed with poured concrete and rebar using a honeycomb design, which sort of reinforced themselves.
As the demolition team prepared the building, excitement built in Providence.
And in preparing the building, because they drilled thousands of holes in the first and second floor, took out doors and windows that existed and drilled these holes, and connecting with the detonation cord, they put in around 1/4 pound of dynamite.
650 pounds of explosives were embedded in the steel-reinforced concrete on the first and second floors that provided support for the T-shaped structure. Early on the morning of May 21st, a warning horn sounded, and a few minutes later, at 8:30 a.m., the plunger was pushed.
There was a huge explosion, rocked the general area, and a big cloud of smoke came up that engulfed the entire building. The only thing I remember seeing is 2 seagulls on the roof of this 10-story high-rise. They remained in sight throughout the implosion. Then we noticed that the building hadn't even moved.
It was kind of embarrassing to both the explosive company and my father's company, because, you know, we're out there experienced in this field, and we do it every day of our lives, and all of a sudden, failure just happens in front of you, in front of your eyes. And it was just embarrassing.
Well, after the first demolition implosion failed, we conducted a planning meeting with all the public safety officials and the implosion specialists, and determined that what was holding the building up was the heavy end stairwells for the building.
After setting new charges in the stairwells, at 1:30 p.m. the plunger came down a second time.
And when that second charge went off and that building started to fall, you had the excitement thinking it was going to go. And then all of a sudden it just got bound up between each other and stood there.
Well, there seemed to be a great deal of laughter from the crowd, a great deal of befuddlement on behalf of the staff and the project managers. We were very disappointed.
The building had fallen about 30 feet and was leaning at a 20-degree angle.
You had a 10-story high-rise leaning towards the public streets. So it was a disaster. It was quite scary, actually. They knew at that point that a third set of charges wouldn't work because of the way the structure was now collapsed and leaning into each other. There was no way for it to fall. So they started voicing their other options, and that's when they had meetings and came to the conclusion that it had to come down with a wrecking ball.
What was supposed to take seconds now was going to take several weeks. Streets had to stay closed and homes and businesses evacuated until the remains of the leaning building were deemed safe. Slowly, the building was pounded into submission without further incident. But the failed implosion was the talk of the town.
Well, in good American spirit, entrepreneurial spirit, we tried to make lemonade with the lemons, even though they were sour lemons. What happened is a number of people were taking photographs, and someone talked about the Tower of Pisa, so we said, now we have the Leaning Tower of Providence. So we made some T-shirts up and actually made some money on the event.
Today, there are a series of low-rise public housing units where the Leaning Tower of Providence defiantly once stood.